This presentation is basically it's a presentation on a particular Inquisition trial that I studied during my research, which particularly disturbed me. So I just want to talk about it and explain why this trial is so historically relevant and interesting, and maybe try to extract some kind of conclusions for the history of magic, maybe. Before we begin dealing with this trial in detail, it needs to firstly be understood that there is a particular relationship between the Portuguese Inquisition and magic. The Portuguese Inquisition was established in 1536, and its main preoccupation throughout all of its existence was the control of Jewish ideas and Jewish people. Basically, as a secondary preoccupation, it was the control of Protestant ideas. So, if we collect all the different trials and documentation produced by the Inquisition, only about 10% of these refer to non-Jewish crimes. Those 10% then being divided among all the other crimes that the Inquisition had jurisdiction of, magic being one of them. Now, this means that any magical trial that we find always has an extra degree of, I won't say it's necessarily extraordinary, but it certainly relates to an unusual historical circumstance, because there was no one in Portugal hunting for witches or magicians. There was no witch hunt in Portugal. There was a Jewish hunt. So for a magician to be caught and denounced, that translates a historical and social moment. There is something specific about that case that meant that the Inquisition paid attention. Now, another thing that needs to be understood about the Domingues case is that it happened in 1654. Now, 1654, we're still in the early years of the third Portuguese dynasty, the Braganza Dynasty, that started in 1640. Now, there is a specific intellectual moment happening here in which that this dynasty starts, like I said, 1640. And before that, Portugal was governed by the Castilian king, what we would call Spain. The cause of this was that in 1578, King Sebastian disappears in the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. This generates a succession crisis. The Spanish king, or the Castilian king, gets the Portuguese crown, and then there is an 80-year period of a foreign king ruling the country. Now, during this period, a certain idea came up among certain members of Portuguese society, be them low members of society or high intellectual ones, that maybe King Sebastian didn't actually die and was hiding or just lost somewhere, that he would return to eventually re-establish Portuguese independence. This became gradually known as Sebastianism, which is a messianic movement that in certain ways still actually exists today. When then the 1640 revolution happens, and once again there is a Portuguese king on top of the Portuguese kingdom, what also happens is that a particular individual, the Jesuit António Vieira, starts to rewrite certain Sebastianist prophecies in order to fit King John IV, the first king of the third Portuguese dynasty, in the place of Sebastian, to claim messianic character to this new king. This was done for multiple reasons, some of which were obviously to offer divine legitimacy to the new king, as well as political legitimacy. So this time period was very rich and intense in terms of publications on messianism, apocalypse, mysticism, millenarianism. So this was a very particular moment of Portuguese literature and intellectual life, and this is when the case of Domingos da Madre de Deus happens. Now, we don't know much about his personal life. We do know that he was born in Trofa, it's in the bishopric of Porto, up north. At a certain point, he traveled to Lisbon, where he joined the Third Order of the Carmelites. So he didn't receive religious orders. He was a lay brother. He then returns up north, where he establishes himself in the St. Vincent Hermitage in Cesures. It's still there. It's been restored recently. And while there, he gradually acquires the fame of being a great healer. There are reports of him healing with herbs and words, performing certain magical rituals which were somewhat common in the Portuguese North, folk magic rituals, and also being particularly skilled in detecting and getting rid of sorcery. Now, sorcery in this context has a specific meaning, or rather the Portuguese feitiço. While contemporarily we might see feitiço as a synonym of the English sorcery, meaning a technique to induce harm, in the early modern period this is not the case, and feitiço actually refers to a tangible physical object, a bundle of materials that had some kind of inherent virtue that when placed in close proximity to its intended victim would cause a supernatural illness. So Domingues was very good at finding these bundles and getting rid of them, usually by burning them. Now, besides all of this, one other thing that Domingues was famous for was prophecy. He was himself a prophet. This is a copy of one of his prophecy books. It's attached to his Inquisition trial. And this is interesting because he was illiterate. So whenever he was prophesying, somebody would have to be called to take note of all his prophecies. At a certain point, Domingues starts to prophesy about the Portuguese king and writes a series of prophecies about certain dangers that the king was under from the Castilian kingdom, and asks that these prophecies be sent to Lisbon. Now, we don't know by which channels these prophecies got to Lisbon, but they got to Lisbon, and eventually they fell into the hands of António Cabide, a crown notary, and Pedro Fernandes Monteiro, a judge and legislator. Now, these two are historical characters. The Portuguese archives have ample documents by them and about them, so these were real people. And they end up traveling up north to Suzures, and with the intention of bringing Domingues to Lisbon, which they do. And the objective for them was they wanted to use Domingues and his prophecies in order to gain the favor of the king, because the king was kind of dependent at this moment for prophecy for his political status. The king, on all accounts, seems to have been actually interested in meeting Domingues, and he established him in the Saint Amaro hermitage near Lisbon. It's also still there. I'm not sure if you can visit it, but it's slightly outside of Lisbon, slightly before Belém. And this, at the time, was considered to be somewhat of a scandal in Lisbon, because the Saint Amaro hermitage was considered to be a very good, prestigious, and beautiful hermitage, and nobody knew Domingues from anywhere, so this was a problem. And overall, he was largely disliked in Lisbon. There are reports of people claiming that he behaved strangely, that he did not act like a prophet or a saint or a hermit or anything, that he ate and drank too much. And there are some more troubling reports that suggest that he was somewhat of a rapist. So overall, he was a problematic individual. Still, on all accounts, the king was interested in meeting him. But before he did that, he needed to have Domingues examined by an expert on prophecy. The purpose of this examination was not so much to determine if Domingues was a prophet. This had actually been determined to be true because some of his prophecies did come true. He predicted there would be a fire in the royal palace, and the fire did happen. But the objective was to determine whether the prophecies of Domingues had their origin in God, making him a genuine prophet, or in some demonic trickery. And the expert that the king found to examine Domingues was none other than Father António Vieira, one of the most relevant intellectual figures of the 17th century. Now the two have a conversation. Father António Vieira at a certain point is forced to throw in the towel. He is unable to determine what's the origins of Domingues' prophecies. He does say, in these things there was doubt, and it could be or not be, meaning he had no idea. Now, the case doesn't go, the story doesn't go much beyond this, as shortly after this, Domingues gets arrested by the Portuguese Inquisition, which was bound to happen. He was becoming increasingly famous, he was attracting political attention, and eventually somebody would be looking at him in a problematic way and denounce him, which happened. Now, what's interesting here is that most magic cases, the most interesting part of the case is before people get arrested, but Domingues actually becomes a lot more interesting after he gets arrested. There are reports from other prison mates, people in other cells in the Inquisition, that claim that strange voices and lights were heard coming from his cell. Everybody was terrified of him. He would lose his consciousness and wake up with the strength of many men. When interrogated, he talked about things in a strange way. He wasn't direct in answering any questions. He seemed to be resistant to the inquisitors. He told outlandish stories of spiritual travels and all the different things that he saw and did. And for a long time, the trial is really an accumulation of confusion by the inquisitors themselves. But at a certain point, it does seem that Domingues somewhat cracks and actually starts to talk. But when he does so, he starts to relate his own life story as if it's like a story, like a narrative. And this is what he says. I'm not claiming any historical validity to what I'm about to say. These are his words. He claims that one day, while in the St. Vincent Hermitage, he was visited by St. Peter with a whole host of angels. St. Peter asked if he wanted to be his student, which Domingues, obviously as a good Christian, said yes. And St. Peter took one drop of blood from his finger. And from that moment on, St. Peter taught him all the different cures and techniques that he knew, all the virtues of all the herbs and all the words. Still, the relationship between St. Peter and Domingues wasn't simple. There was tension between both of them, and eventually St. Peter gets tired and actually reveals himself not as St. Peter, but actually as a devil called Beltrão, who had tricked him. And in fact, the drop of blood that he had taken from Domingues constituted the pact. And now they had a pact which Domingues could not escape. Now, it doesn't seem that this bothered Domingues that much. He actually, accepted that he now had a familiar devil. And they kept working together for a long time. They were doing good work, healing and gaining fame, so there was no harm done. And among the several techniques, among the several teachings that Beltrão then explicitly gives to Domingues as forms of demonic magic, is something which is what I want to talk about in this presentation, which is something he referred to as the Doctrine of Sorcery. Now again, this is in the Portuguese, the Doutrina dos Feitiços, so there is a material aspect to what's being discussed here. And this seems to be a complete system for the creation and counteraction of feitiços. In particular, the Domingos refers or offers the Doctrine of Sorcery to the Inquisitors originally as his technique in order to detect and counteract sorcery. In particular, the Doctrine of Sorcery was useful when he couldn't locate the actual feitiço, the actual object. So the solution in those cases were, using the Doctrine of Sorcery, he would have to create a counter-sorcery in order to heal the original one. And this is what Domingues says about how to construct sorcery. He also taught him, the defendant, that there were 10 types of sorceries, that these were always done with a specific purpose and for a limited time, be it to bend a will or some other effect. This would be within the terms predetermined by the person who intended them. Now, these sorceries could be made from a variety of objects. Domingos lists a few. Linen threads weaved by 9 Marias. Objects made by women named Maria usually have magical powers in Portuguese folk magic. Feathers of any kind of bird, a bone from the head of a frog, some part of a salamander, bread, seeds, and then there's something I can't read, the handwriting is difficult. Then he could also add bits or objects from the person the sorcery was intended for, hair, bits of a dress, something that was a wound, like a knife, or something from a person's job, so if this was a carpenter, something like a hammer. Then, all of the materials should be buried, all of these different materials buried in the crossroads, and reeds cut from a bog planted over them. The following nights, the reeds would have grown, and these ingredients picked and wrapped in a bundle. Now, this suggests that all the objects would be buried with reeds on top of them, and only a few reeds would grow. This would indicate the specific objects necessary for the sorcery. And this would then be a new simulacrum of the original sorcery, and it could then be offered to cure the patient. Now, as let's say, a spin-off of the Doctrine of Sorcery, something that was an integrating part of the Doctrine of Sorcery, is are the instructions for the creation of another type of object, which is a magical fava bean. Now, magical fava beans are common in Portuguese, Spanish, and French in folk magic. And these are these fava beans that you have to kill a cat, and then you put a fava bean inside it, and you bury it, and then the plant that grows is supposed to have magic powers. And this is what Domingues says about how to create fava beans according to the Doctrine of Sorcery. A black cat was killed on St. John's Eve. buried under a black fig tree, and placing a fava either in its mouth or eye, according to the lots of the reeds, meaning that the place of the fava needed to be determined in the same way that the several ingredients of the sorcery were also determined, before it is buried, and when one buries it, he should tie its tail to one of the roots of the tree, which the old man, meaning Beltrão, would teach him to recognize. And in the following 5 days after this, the tree would bear fruit, and among them one fig larger than the others. And at that point, one should pick the mentioned fava, and this would be taken by the same person who planted it, and in this way would the mentioned fava acquire such virtue and efficiency that it would work all which the defendant would apply it to, being it according to the intention which it was planted and picked. Now, if we examine the doctrine of sorcery from the outside, externally, we notice that what Domingues is describing is that there is actually no direct correlation between the different ingredients he used to create the sorcery and the effects of that sorcery. This is actually in accordance with certain theological thinking about sorcery at that time, which most theological analysis claims that sorcery has no actual action in itself. The virtues of a sorcery are given to it externally by a demonic agency. Now it seems that Domingues is alluding to this, but he is actually turning this upside down, because he is removing agency from a demonic force and placing it rather on the intention, will, or imagination of the sorcerer. Now this is interesting because it does translate a certain new understanding of magic or magical power, which was somewhat common in the Renaissance, which is the removal of the centrality of magic from God or the devil and placing it rather in a more human-centric conception. Now, I would be fine with this were Domingues not illiterate. So I am forced to always wonder, how did he actually come across this idea? That it was not so much the intervention of the devil, although the devil was involved, this was specifically demonic magic, but it was rather the intention of the individual that determined the power of the sorcery. Because if we look at Renaissance magic, this is actually quite a common idea. We have this in Marsilio Ficino, in Paracelsus, that puts the imagination or the intention of not only the practitioner, but in case of Paracelsus, his doctor, the patient, in the determination of a cure. And this same centrality of intention and imagination, if we then travel to the 19th and even 20th century, is one of the foundational bases of what historically might be actually called occultism. So this is, to me, what the mystery of this trial. How does an illiterate hermit, a Carmelite, apparently acquire the knowledge that, rather while common in his time, is somewhat radically removed from his social context? I consider this trial personally to be a historical mystery. Now, I have something called conclusions, although I actually don't have any real conclusions that I can offer. Except that, well, Domingues, when he got to talk and confess, he told his story as if this was a novel. Reading his statements, he seemed almost excited about being able to tell his story to the inquisitors. With this mentality, it could be that this doctrine of sorcery was simply one other aspect of this apparent self-centeredness. One other way for him to place himself in the middle of a cosmic drama, as was frequently the case among these type of Inquisition trials. Still, Domingues did not claim special powers, and on all accounts, these sorcerer's techniques he described seem to be accessible to all individuals, not just him. Whatever the meaning of this, it is undeniable that even if we choose to simply disregard all of these elements, all of Domingues' narratives as fantasy or ignorance or hysteria, we are still clearly dealing with a remarkable individual that seemed to somehow have access to learned concepts of magic and esotericism in a context where he wasn't supposed to have access to that. It is this remarkableness that will likely forever shroud this trial in mystery. Thank you.